You hear them before you see them. The sound of iron dragging against stone. Thousands of feet moving in synchronized rhythm. The low murmur of a crowd gathering like a storm. You're pressed against the wall of a building in Rome, year 71 AD, watching the Via Sacra fill with humanity. The triumph is coming. Everyone has been talking about it for weeks, the great victory in Judea. The suppression of the rebellion, the return of Titus with proof of Rome's eternal dominance. The crowd around you surges forward, eager for spectacle. Then you see them. Walking between the legionaries, chained wrist to wrist, in lines that seem endless, are women. Hundreds of them. Their clothes are torn, their hair matted with dust from months of marching. But it's their eyes that make you look away. Empty, as if whatever made them human has already been extracted. Leaving only shells that breathe and walk, but no longer live. If you're watching this, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are. I'm genuinely amazed that stories like this connect us across every border and culture. Hit subscribe if you want history without the comfortable lies. What you're witnessing is the machinery of empire at its most efficient. This isn't chaos. This isn't the random cruelty of soldiers drunk on victory. This is procedure, protocol, a system so well organized that it appears in military manuals, in administrative records, in tax documents preserved for 2 millennia. Because Rome didn't just conquer territory, it conquered peoples. And it understood that true dominion isn't achieved by occupying land, it's achieved by erasing identity, by breaking continuity, by ensuring that the defeated can never reconstitute themselves into a threat. The women in those chains are the final phase of a process that began months earlier, the moment their cities fell. And what happened to them, what Rome did, systematically, legally, with the full blessing of state and societies, a story that's been carefully edited from the glorious narrative we're taught. The version where Rome represents civilization, order, law. Where the legions are disciplined heroes bringing light to barbarian darkness. That version is incomplete. Not wrong, exactly. Just missing the parts that make us uncomfortable. The parts that reveal what civilization actually costs and who pays the price. The process began not with the triumph in Rome, but with the fall of the city, any city that resisted Roman authority. Let's trace one woman's journey through the machine. Her name is Tamar. She's 19 years old, living in a fortified town in Judea during the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 AD. She has a husband, a 1-year-old daughter, and a small house with a courtyard where fig trees grow. She knows the Romans are coming. Everyone knows. They've heard reports from other cities. But her town has strong walls, determined defenders. They believe they can hold. They hold for 11 days. When the walls are breached, and they're always breached. Eventually, the systematic sorting begins immediately. Not looting first, not celebratory chaos. Sorting. Roman officers move through the streets with scribes carrying wax tablets, dividing the surviving population into categories as methodically as merchants inventorying grain. Men of fighting age are separated first. Tamar watches her husband pulled into a group that's marched toward the city center. She never sees him again. Later, she hears that some were executed as examples, others reserved for the arena. But in that moment, she's focused on her daughter, holding the child so tightly the baby begins to cry. An officer approaches. He looks at Tamar, not at her face, but at her body, her age, her physical condition, with a detached assessment of someone evaluating livestock. He glances at the child, then says something in Latin to the scribe, who makes a mark on his tablet. 2 soldiers step forward. One takes the baby from Tamar's arms. The other holds Tamar back when she tries to follow. Her daughter is screaming. Tamar is screaming. The soldier holding her doesn't even look at her face. He's watching the scribe, waiting for the next instruction. The baby is carried toward a group of elderly women and small children being assembled near the town gate. Tamar will learn later that this group was released, left behind as useless mouths. a drain on military logistics. Whether her daughter survived without her mother, whether any of those elderly women had the resources to care for an infant during a famine, Tamar will never know, because she's being pushed toward a different group. The third category: young women without dependent children, physically sound, valuable. They're held in the central square for 2 days. Hundreds of them, sitting in the sun without shade, given water twice daily, enough to survive, but not enough to feel human. Officers walk among them periodically, selecting. Some women are marked with red ochre on the shoulder, maybe 20 from Tamar's town. The prettiest ones, the youngest, those unmarked by childbirth or hard labor. Tamar isn't selected for this group. Later, she realized this might have saved her life, though saved will become a word she can't think about without bitterness. The women marked with red ochre are designated for officers. The rest, including Tamar, are allocated to the regular legionaries. This isn't a reward for individual soldiers. It's systematic distribution, recorded in military logs with the same precision as weapons, inventory, or food supplies. A fragment of one such log, preserved in the British Museum, lists among routine campaign entries from the Siege of Giscala 340 women of suitable age distributed among the cohorts. Ratio: 1 per 8 men. That phrase, 1 per 8 men, appears in multiple documents from different campaigns. It wasn't random. It was policy, standard practice. And what it meant for Tamar was that for the next week, she existed for the use of soldiers who were celebrating their victory. She was kept in a commandeered building near the Legion's camp. Different men each night, sometimes during the day. She stopped counting after the first dozen, stopped trying to remember their faces, stopped trying to be anywhere but somewhere else inside her own head. One of the soldiers talked to her afterward, unusual because most treated the women as if they were inanimate. He was younger, maybe 20, and he seemed to need her to understand something. "This is what you get for resisting Rome," he said in broken Aramaic. "This is what happens when you fight civilization." He said it earnestly, as if he was explaining something important, as if he genuinely believed he was teaching a lesson rather than committing rape, as if the act itself was educational, corrective. Tamar said nothing. She'd already learned that silence was safer than speech. But she thought, "You believe you're civilized because you do this with organization instead of chaos, because you write it down instead of pretending it didn't happen, because you've made it legal." After a week, the unit was ready to move. The women were prepared for transport. This involved branding, a practice borrowed from the marking of cattle, now applied to humans. Heated iron pressed against flesh, usually the upper arm or sometimes the face. Burning, a symbol that identified the legion and the campaign. The mark was permanent. Even if a woman was later freed, even decades later, the brand would remain. Visual proof of what she'd been, where she'd come from. A scar that spoke before she could, that told everyone who saw her, this one was conquered. They were chained together in groups of 20, connected by iron links that allowed walking but prevented running. Then began the march to the coast weeks of walking. Minimal food, sleeping on the ground. Women who became too sick or injured to continue were simply unchained and abandoned by the roadside. No one killed them. There was no need. The land they were crossing had been stripped of resources by the legion's advance. To be left behind was death, just slower. Tamar made it to the coast. Many didn't. At the port, they were held in warehouses, stone buildings that smelled of old fish and salt, dark except for narrow openings near the roof. They stayed there for weeks, waiting for ships to be available. The conditions were worse than the march. Confined space, poor ventilation, dysentery spreading through the crowded room. Women died in the night. Their bodies were dragged out each morning by slaves who performed this task with the bored efficiency of routine labor. A merchant's ledger from Alexandria, dated to 117 AD, survives in fragmentary form. Among the cargo listings for a grain ship traveling from Judea to Rome, 240 amphorae of olive oil, 80 bolts of linen, 63 women of Judean origin. 15 horses. The women are listed between fabric and livestock. Same document. Same categories. Same economic value. The sea voyage took 3 weeks. They were kept below deck in a space designed for cargo, not passengers. The ceiling was too low to stand fully upright. They sat or lay in rows, still chained, in darkness broken only when sailors opened the hatch to throw down bread and pour water. The ship moved constantly, rolling with the sea's rhythm, and there were no facilities for waste. The smell became unbearable, but eventually the senses adjusted or simply gave up. Several women died during the crossing. Their bodies were removed and thrown into the sea without ceremony. One sailor remarked, loud enough for some of the women to hear, that the fish were eating well this season. When they finally arrived in Rome, they were unloaded like the cargo they'd been listed as. Moved to holding facilities near the docks. Given their first real meal in days Rome, wanted them presentable for sale. Wanted the merchandise to look viable. They were allowed to wash, given clean tunics. The investment had to look worthwhile. The sale happened in Rome's old cattle market, a place once meant for animals and now repurposed for people. Women stood in rows while buyers passed among them, touching skin, checking teeth, inspecting hair. There was no secrecy, no shame. It was a legal transaction, taxed by the state and accepted as part of ordinary commerce. One of those women was Tamar, taken from the eastern provinces after a small revolt that barely registered in the histories. A brothel owner from the crowded district of Subura bought her for a middle price valuable enough to expect years of work. Not valuable enough to protect from disposal when she broke down. The building where she was sent was narrow and anonymous, hidden behind public theaters and taverns. Inside, it was organized like a factory, a hallway with tiny rooms. Each room held a bed, a lamp, and walls scratched with the remnants of previous lives. Names, curses, prayers, and sometimes the quiet announcement that someone had died there. These marks were the only records that women like Tamar ever left behind. She worked almost every day. On busy weeks, she saw more men than she could remember, faces blurring into one long procession of transactions. Customers were not monsters from the margins of society. They were the city itself, shopkeepers, port workers, clerks, visitors from distant provinces. Men who believed that buying a woman's body was no more remarkable than buying bread. The brothel owner described himself as practical. He did not permit unnecessary violence because it damaged profits. Once a month, a physician inspected the women, less as patients than as assets. Pregnancy was prevented or terminated because it interfered with productivity. No one used the word rape. The language was business: output, decline, replacement. Tamar learned Latin quickly, not out of curiosity, but because misunderstanding a customer could result in punishment. Her own language, once the voice of her childhood, her family, her prayers slowly retreated. She whispered words in it at night, afraid that if she stopped, it would vanish entirely. She felt herself becoming someone else, a person shaped by survival rather than memory. One day a client asked her name. She gave it, and he frowned, repeated it wrong, then laughed. "Too foreign," he said. "I'll call you Maria." The name stuck. Up to that, she offered it first. It required less effort than explaining who she had once been. In her 3rd year, the doctor discovered a growth inside her. He spoke to the owner, not to Tamar. Treatment was expensive, and she was already past her most profitable stage. She was sold cheaply to a rural estate outside the city, listed in the paperwork as damaged stock. On the farm, she worked until she collapsed in the fields. The overseer moved her to a shed so she would not disturb the others. There, alone, she died. The estate's records note only a loss of one female slave, Eastern origin. Her name never appears again. Her story was not unusual. During Rome's expansion, millions of people were enslaved. Women made up a vast portion of that number, and many were funneled into sexual labor. Most vanished into the accounting systems of empire, reduced to numbers on tablets and in ledgers. Yet traces survive. A tombstone near the northern frontier bears an inscription in 2 languages, Latin above, a local Celtic tongue below. It marks the grave of a woman taken from her homeland who, according to the inscription, never forgot the language of her mother. Someone had paid extra to carve words most Romans could not read. It was a small act of resistance, a refusal to let assimilation be complete. Medical texts from the period reveal another layer. One physician wrote calmly about the ailments common among women in commercial sexual service, then offered advice to owners on how long such women were likely to remain useful. The tone is clinical, but the meaning is unmistakable. People were being consumed at a predictable rate, and the system was optimized around that destruction. Even the philosophers noticed. One Roman writer admitted that the peace Rome claimed to bring looked very different to the conquered. He had seen the markets and the brothels, and wondered whether those Rome called barbarians might judge Roman civilization to be crueler than their own. Yet he owned slaves himself, and freed none. His insight changed nothing, because the system allowed moral discomfort without requiring moral action. This is the paradox of empire. It produces marvels roads, aqueducts, literature, law while simultaneously destroying lives at industrial scale. Both are true, and history has often chosen to celebrate one while ignoring the other. In the modern era, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave in what is now southern France. The remains were all women, all bearing signs of long-term abuse and malnutrition. Chemical analysis showed they came from across the empire. No museum claimed them. The land was redeveloped. They disappeared again, erased a second time. The pattern continues. Systems that rely on domination eventually learn how to disguise it. They rename violence as policy, suffering as necessity, exploitation as order. By the time the Geneva Conventions finally recognized sexual violence as a war crime, centuries of empires had already normalized it as an unfortunate side effect of conquest. When we teach about Rome, we still emphasize its monuments and achievements. We marvel at its architecture. Quote, its philosophers, walk its ruins in awe. Rarely do we pause to ask how many women like Tamar passed unseen through the shadow of that grandeur. The missing names form their own testimony. Every blank in the records is evidence of a life deliberately reduced to inventory. The empire is long gone, but the machinery of erasure remains. It survives whenever beauty is allowed to excuse brutality, whenever progress is celebrated without counting the bodies beneath it. Tamar cannot speak, but the silence around her is not empty. It is full of questions we still avoid asking. Somewhere beneath Roman ruins, beneath the shops and museums and tourist sites, beneath the civilizational pride and historical admiration, lie the bones of women whose names no one carved in stone. They built Rome as surely as its engineers and generals did. They paid for its glory with everything they were. And we, who inherit Rome's legal traditions and architectural forms and civilizational self-image, inherit also the responsibility to remember what we prefer to forget. The machinery that consumed them is still operating. We've merely updated its language. And every time we choose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth, we prove that Rome's greatest triumph wasn't territorial. It was teaching us to celebrate the architecture while ignoring the screaming in the foundations.